starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this valuable Power Retail webinar session brought to you today by global digital performance agency Croud. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Pranitha Govender. I'm the editor of Power Retail, and I'll be introducing our guest speaker very shortly. Before the introduction, though, some quick housekeeping. Mobile phones, if you can please turn these to silent. I can't ridicule you if it goes off because I won't hear it. But that's besides the point. You probably want to pay attention this afternoon because it's going to be a great session. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time for your questions. You can enter these at any time in the question dialog box on your dashboard, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. We've got a big session ahead this afternoon, so get comfortable. With online sales in the Asia Pacific region alone set to exceed $3.8 trillion by 2021, the international e-commerce opportunity for Australian brands and retailers is undeniable. And while China is Australia's largest export market for both goods and services, there are many other markets that are ripe for expansion, from Japan to Singapore to the US. How can you leverage off this massive boom in cross-border e-commerce? Today we have Dan Richardson, Managing Director at Croud, who will help uncover the export opportunity for Australian retailers. Today you'll learn how to identify the best markets for you, the tools available to help you do this, and you'll also learn about some common mistakes and how to avoid them, important considerations, and much, much more. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dan Richardson.
Oh, thank you very much indeed for the introduction, Pranitha, and hello everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited to spend some time with you this afternoon talking about one of my favourite subjects, which is international e-commerce. Let's crack on. As Pranitha said, today's session we're going to start by looking at the export opportunity for Australian retailers. We're then going to look at some of the tools available to help identify the best markets for you before running through 5 key areas that I think people should think about when they consider planning and executing paid search across international markets. I just very quickly wanted to kick off with a brief bit of background to Croud. We're a global agency with offices in Australia, the UK and the US, and we offer a fully integrated range of joined up digital services that help brands essentially sell more online. And we work extensively in the retail space, and we support brands across multiple markets internationally. And we're able to add value really quickly, and that's one of our definite USPs. For example, the paid search accounts we run for DKNY, which we do across 9 different markets, saw some pretty dramatic increases within the first 6 months of working together. So let's start, though, by looking at the global opportunity for Australian retailers. The reason international expansion should be on the minds of any ambitious local e-commerce business is that the Australian market is comparatively, I'll put my teeth in, small. And whilst e-commerce continues to grow here, the population, as we know, is only 24 million people. So the population is small. Or to put it another way, we're just 0.32% of the total global population. So there are a lot of people beyond these shores. And as I said, e-commerce in Australia has been growing pretty consistently over the last few years and is forecast to keep going at an annual rate of about 8.8% by 2022. Just to put that into context, the global e-commerce market is set to more than double from 2.3 trillion US dollars last year to just under 4.8 trillion by 2021. And as we know, shopping is definitely one of the most popular online activities worldwide. But interestingly, the usage varies greatly by region. A stat that I read the other day said that in 2016, an estimated 19% of all retail sales in China occurred via the internet. I bet that number's grown since then. But in Japan, interestingly, the share was only 6.7%. So big opportunity globally, but lots of subtle differences that we need to be aware of. And as stated on the previous slide, Australian e-commerce was valued at $17.7 billion. Now that equates to just over 13 billion US dollars, or 26 times smaller than the US currently. So the global opportunity, as I say, is vast. And here we can see this is the top 10 biggest e-commerce markets according to Shopify. Now, unsurprisingly, China is by far and away the biggest and as we know, has grown rapidly over the past 10 years or so, pretty much in line with the internet penetration, especially in some of those rural areas. Now, if we look here, the English-speaking countries in the top 10, so the US, the UK, and Canada, they've got a combined value of around 440 billion US dollars, and would certainly possibly be easier markets to enter, given the, I was going to say commonality in language, but I'm not quite sure that's always the case. And consumers are increasingly at ease with buying goods online from overseas companies. Now, according to this survey that we saw in business.com, over half the people surveyed across these different continents were more than happy to buy from international e-commerce business. In fact, had done so in the previous 6 months. It's only the US that is under 50% of those people. So you want to tap into this global opportunity, but often the question is, well, where do I start? So let's have a look at a number of free tools that can help you with just that. I think one of the first places to start should always be your own data, so your own analytics, whether that's Google Analytics or another provider. And in here, you'll be able to see, without wishing to teach people to suck eggs, but obviously you can see which countries are driving traffic to your website or where your visitors are visiting from. You'll know from your own sales data already whether or not you're making sales internationally. But what analytics can tell you is perhaps where visitors are coming from that perhaps haven't gone on to buy from you. But maybe, as you can see in this example, the bounce rates are relatively low, which would suggest that, you know, the content and the products are of interest. But if people aren't buying, then there must be some barriers to that. It'd be interesting to understand why. So that's the first place to start. And then Google provide a whole range of free tools, which are brilliant, actually. And one of my favorite ones is the Consumer Barometer. And this does a number of different things, but enables you to really understand how people use the internet across different countries. And there are some sometimes big differences in how people engage online. One of the things that we use it a lot for is really just to understand what different paths to purchase look like. So by country, how do different consumers research and evaluate before they buy? And one of the things that this really helps just to kind of to understand is which channels you should be investing your money in and at what point. So that's terrific. And then you can also compare all sorts of data across market and answer a whole bunch of questions that Google have got in here as well. So the example I have on this slide, asks the question, why do people purchase products online from foreign countries? And that's often a really useful thing to understand whilst you're choosing the markets that you want to go after. Another tool from Google is specifically for its shopping products, and unfortunately at the moment this is only available in the US, or only shows US data rather. But if the US is a market that you're considering, then this tool is fantastic. It helps you visualize all sorts of data going all the way back to 2014. You can see how products have become or increased and decreased in popularity, and enables you to really drill down into city level data. 16,000 different US cities are included in here. And those kind of insights really do help to drive data-driven decisions in the business. And often heat mapping is a really useful thing to do with the data, your own data as well. I'll give you a very quick example of a client that we've worked with to help launch into the US. They're a shoe retailer, e-commerce only in the US, but wanted to open their first physical store. So we took the data from AdWords and looked specifically at click-through rates and conversion rates, and took that data and created a heat map which showed which town and in which state was probably going to be the best location to open a store. And indeed, that's what that retailer went on to do. So have a play with this. It is massively valuable. There's lots of different things that you can do with it and compare lots of different categories. Now, the US, we were just chatting about that, it's a big country, obviously, and there are some significant differences when dealing with different parts of the United States. And work that we've done over the years, specifically this example, it relates to fashion retail, threw up some interesting insights which I thought I'd share. So New York, which is just a quick test here on your state flag knowledge, but New York at the top, has more than twice the possible search volume compared to any other state in the US. It also has a higher conversion rate, and the value of those conversions on average tends to be between 10 and 20%. So a significant area there. California, on the other hand, has a lower cost per click to the national average, but again, really good search volume. A lot of people out on the West Coast. When we think about Florida, they actually have the lowest cost per click for fashion. If you're in that category, then that's good to know. But the conversion rate remains on par with the national average. However, the volume for the click volume is around 5% of New York, so not as much volume, but a lower cost. And then finally, Texas, the lone state, similar volumes to Florida, lower conversion rate on fashion. An average order value is slightly below the national average. So it's really important when you're thinking about countries such as the US or indeed China or Russia, you know, these big countries which really have some significant differences from state to state, and that should certainly play a part in your planning. My favorite tool, however, is Google Market Finder. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have managed to have a play with this yet. There's a link at the bottom of this slide. I think we're sharing the slides at the end, but I encourage everyone to go and have a play. In fact, I will just quickly click through and show you some of what it can do, because I think this is a huge help for anyone who's looking at exporting around the world. So simply what you do is you pop in your URL of your website. You have to agree to certain things. And what Google do is it'll go off and look at the website, and it'll decide which categories it thinks are most relevant based on the pages of your website. You can go in and add categories, which I suggest you do, because whilst Google is good at many things, it's not always brilliant at knowing exactly what your website is targeted to sell. So add in different categories, and then as you can see here, it will suggest markets to you, and it ranks them. And it basically ranks, I think, every single market that it covers. So as you can see in this example, the United States comes out as the #1 market for us in this instance, and it bases it on a number of things. The main factor is the monthly searches, so category searches for people looking for the products that you're selling. So as you can see here, it's around 34 million searches a month. You must always take Google numbers with a slight pinch of salt. I'm sure you know that already. The other interesting factor that it considers is basically the ease of doing business. So it looks at different regulatory considerations as well, and that certainly becomes a ranking factor. It's useful to understand what Google thinks you should be bidding. Again, that always tends to be slightly higher than reality. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the disposable income, average disposable income for households in those countries. And then you can basically add and remove these from your lists or from your shortlist, which is great. But beyond that, I think where Google has kind of gone beyond what you'd expect of it possibly is it does give you a whole bunch of resources to help you plan your operations, because of course there's so much more to conducting business, even e-commerce business overseas, than simply running some ads and having a local website. There's all sorts of things you need to consider. Some of the things we'll just dive into here quickly. So it will look at payments, obviously a massive consideration for you when you expand into other markets is your ability to provide payment solutions. So of the 3 countries that I put on my shortlist, Germany, the UK and the US, for each of those markets, it will show me what the most popular form of payment is. So in Germany, it's a bank transfer. We go to the UK where it's a debit card, and the US, it's credit cards. And actually what you can do from here as well is just click through and it will show you perhaps what the most prominent brands are in those markets. So fairly obvious, I think, for the US and the UK. We're familiar with lots of these brands, but for some of the other countries, certainly across APAC, for example, this kind of insight can be really, really useful, and certainly research you'd need to do anyway, but Google have brought it all into this one place for you. It also just has a bit of a handy dashboard. So as you work through each of these key areas, it will show how you're doing. So I just thought I'd share that one with you. Do go and have a look. It's, I'd say, one of my favorite things I think Google have done, and probably one of the most useful tools that they've got. Obviously, a whole bunch of other things to think about, and I've just touched on some of them as well. But when we're looking at which international markets might be best for you, I think the other things that would be top of mind for me are, what's the competition? What's the lay of the land there? Are there any other international or indeed Australian businesses already doing business in that country? A key consideration, of course, is going to be how are you going to manage and facilitate customer service? And how are you going to organize your shipping and returns? Because as we know, those two things are really top of mind for consumers when it comes to deciding if they're going to make a purchase or not. And those are big things to think about and to work through. Currency and payment we've touched on. The Google tool I just showed you also touches on taxes and tariffs. So it'll explain what the tax rates are, how many payments you have to make a year, all of those sorts of things. There are much more qualified people to talk about exporting, but obviously that's a big consideration as well, and fulfillment, of course. But culture is something that is really important to understand and to learn about. And certainly in our experience, when we've been working in countries such as Japan, where we know now that the people in Japan are generally bit more reserved, and so you need to be advertising to them and talking to them in a very different way than you would, say, a European or someone from the US. And then China is almost a completely different beast all on its own. Obviously, for Australian retailers, as we said at the beginning, it's a massive market, no doubt about it, and does present huge opportunity. It is just quite challenging to be able to do business there generally, and also can be challenging from a digital marketing perspective as well, due to mainly language and cultural, I was going to say barriers, but that's not quite the right word. But the way that we work in China, and we do support businesses and increasingly retailers in China, is that we've invested the time to build out an internal team supported by an extended network of people who are nationals and live in those countries, so live in China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, which gives us the ability to obviously not just translate, but actually create content in the mother tongue, and I think that's absolutely key. I mentioned we work with a couple of retailers there, so both the Cambridge Satchel Company and Net-a-Porter we've worked with in China, managing accounts across predominantly Baidu, which is obviously the big search engine in China due to the fact that Google is banned. And I've mentioned culture a couple of slides back, and it is really important and will make a huge difference. That cultural understanding will really help you to succeed in your international e-commerce. And an example for the Cambridge Satchel Company in China is that we were running some AdWords, I can't call them AdWords, we were running some ads on Baidu, and for and at the time of the local event 618 online shopping festival. So we wanted to do a bit of a test and basically run two different ad copies, which would send users to the same page, talk about the same products and everything, but one just talked about a summer sale, and the other one specifically mentioned 618 festival. Now, what was interesting here is that whilst we set them both to be to rotate evenly, Baidu actually decided to give much more weight to the one that mentioned the 618 festival, and in fact generated 83% more impressions than the other ad. So that wasn't necessarily end users engaging differently, but that was the search engine itself deciding that that ad was much more relevant and therefore would get much more exposure. And that's how we work with all of our clients. Just very quickly, our big benefit to retailers internationally is our network, and we work with over 1,200 digital experts, as it says here, in over 100 markets, and we have 77 different languages that we're able to work in, and that's really what has enabled us to support many retailers at a global level, because we have one overall strategy, which is then implemented locally by people on the ground who speak the language, understand the culture, and all of those important things. So just as a bit of a recap, to identify the best markets for you, Start with your own data. First-party data is going to be really important. There's probably stuff in there that you're already aware of, but do dig a little bit deeper and see what other insights that you can glean from there. Google, I've talked about them a lot. They do provide some great free tools. There are others, obviously, as well, and there are other paid tools that you should consider too. But spend time with those tools to really do the research and to understand what those opportunities look like for you. At the same time, certainly be aware of those differences. As I say, even in the same country, there can be significant differences in behavior, in costs, in all sorts of things. And then, as I'm sure you would, you don't want to jump into these things without a proper, full understanding of all the ins and outs of doing business in a specific market. So now we move on to how to plan and execute an international paid search campaign. And during this section, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the pitfalls that you really need to watch out for as well. So one of the first things, and it's going to sound really, really obvious, but it is absolutely fundamentally important that you have a clear objective from the outset. And those objectives cover a whole plethora of things. We've worked with clients before, not in retail, but other sectors, who have kind of said, right, we want to work, we want to launch in Asia, without having given too much thought up front about which specific Asian countries they want to launch in first. And as we know, the differences in country, language, and culture, which I mentioned before, is significant. So having a real understanding, an early gut feel of the specific countries you want to go after is very important. But beyond that, the other objectives you need to think about are, are we looking to generate incremental sales, or do we need to start really by building our brand, or even building a category? Are the products we're selling, are they popular already in that country, or are we trying to build something up from scratch? So that's another really important objective to understand from the get-go, because that really leads into how you're going to implement your marketing, or which parts of the funnel that you really need to influence. And as I say, are you building that category or brand, or is it about sales? Because the way that you tackle those two things will be completely different. And we need to give, you need to understand that from the beginning. One of the sort of frameworks that we use to help with this, and in fact, it really looks at the customer journey from start to finish, and thinking about the different tools and importantly tactics and channels that we should be using from an advertising perspective. So, we're launching into a new country. Let's say we're selling, I don't know, umbrellas. I'm from England, so umbrellas are always top of mind. So there's a whole pool of people who are potential customers. Chances are a lot of those people aren't currently thinking about buying an umbrella. But you want to build your brand, you want to build your presence and generate awareness. So, good ways of doing that would be by using prospecting through display, certainly social to raise brand awareness. Content's important here as well, and YouTube is a good channel to be able to generate that. What happens there is that your total audience will then start to fall into separate buckets depending on how they or have not engaged with your advertising and your messaging at that point. And that enables us then to think about how we start using retargeting from a display perspective, and how we get much more to the pointy end for social. Affiliates, I think, is a really interesting consideration at this point as well. And paid search, really, looking at utilizing generic keywords rather than either brand terms, rather than brand terms. From there, again, depending on what happens with your audiences, we can start to get into sort of slightly more of the pointy end from a paid search perspective. So really start bidding on upping bids on those head terms that would help drive traffic through. And then once people have purchased, what do we do with them afterwards? How do we keep those high value customers coming back? And undoubtedly, you'll have customers that don't come back as often as we'd like. So how do we re-engage with them, and how do we bring them back into the funnel? The second area, or one of the ones, so outside of objectives, probably the most important area really is how you're going to structure your campaign, your typically AdWords campaign, given the dominance of Google internationally. We will talk about some of the other search engines shortly. And for us, it's always about, well, you need to start with the basics. So these are the things that you should be doing anyway for your local campaigns. But when you're building out a campaign, you need to think a bit further down the track. You need to consider the long-term scalability of that account and enable or develop a structure that enables that to happen easily. You don't want, as you launch into new countries and other markets, you don't want your accounts to become, just unwieldy and difficult to manage, because you'll miss out opportunity, and chances are you'll be blowing budgets. So really spend time to think about the structure of that account and plan for its growth in the future. One of the ways that you can help with that certainly is by using a clear naming convention. And this is, again, important for international campaigns as well. You want that naming convention to remain consistent across accounts. And that's important for things like the ability to report and gain insights and things like that. Clearly, campaigns should be logical. You'd hope that that would be a given. What we mean by that is, following the structure of your website. So if it's, URL/men's/trousers, for example, then that's the way that your campaign or account should be structured as well. And that will enable you to develop a real granular, or to have granular campaigns and ad groups. And the granularity is important because it gives you control. And when I talk about control, I'm mainly talking around budget, so that you're not, you haven't got too many keywords or ad groups together, and some are spending a lot and some aren't. You really need to be able to control that. The best way to do it is just to be as granular as possible. So, you'd hope that any AdWords account or paid search account would be set up in this way. When we think about international campaigns, and again, it might seem to be really obvious, that first one, but we've seen instances where this hasn't been the case, and we've taken on accounts where all countries are piled into one account, and that is just, well, as I said, it's difficult to manage, and it's really hard to get any kind of insight that's going to help you improve performance. So we strongly recommend that you split out each country into different accounts, and actually within that, our best practice would be to split out countries that have different languages. So maybe an example of that might be, in the US, where it's mainly English, but obviously Spanish is the second, is a big language in the US, and you might decide that you want to target Spanish speakers there as well. So we would suggest that you split out those into separate accounts as well. That would be in line with best practice, although, some people would prefer to keep them together, and that's not the end of the world. One thing you should definitely watch out for, though, is to make sure that your accounts are set up in local time zones, because if you don't take that step to actually set up the time zone, it will default to your local time zone, and then that sort of throws everything off when you're trying to increase your presence and visibility during peak periods. So when it comes to day of week parting or hour of day parting, and maybe we want to boost increase bids at between 4 and 7 in the evening, if you haven't set your local time zones, it will do it to 4 to 7 in the evening in Australia, which of course is no good if you're targeting further afield. So do watch out for that one. Another one which is really important and highly recommended is to set your audiences at the MCC level. So that's right, the very top level. And basically what that means or enables is every account to follow the same audience structure. And that's just a very simple way of getting that in place and ensuring that that works across all of the accounts within the MCC. And a strong recommendation as well would be to consider using a third-party management tool. And this is probably more important as well if you're using other search engines. So in other markets, if you're selling into Korea and you're advertising on Naver or Yandex in Russia, for example, if you're using the proprietary tool from a particular search engine, you can only see really that search engine results within the reporting interface. So by using a third-party management tool like DoubleClick, for example, you'll be able to facilitate that management of multiple markets, but also multiple engines. And the other thing that you can do then also is set your currency, your overarching currency, maybe into the local currency, so that your reporting across the business can all be in the same currency, which is often very useful. So you've got your structure set up. It's as it should, it's in good best practice as it should be. One of the biggest mistakes you can make, though, is not by spending the right amount of time and effort to make sure that you are localizing everything for that market. And as it says here, don't simply translate. Lots of things get lost in translation, and it can cause all sorts of headaches, and it can have a significant impact on performance. If you're going into a new market and you just want to test something, then Google has a really good free tool. It's a plugin that you can put on your site, and it'll translate your website content based on where that visitor has come from. And it's pretty good, but like all translation tools, it's not perfect. And in fact, we believe you shouldn't be translating. You should be creating from scratch in the local language. And the only way you can do that really with 100% confidence is by engaging somebody who not only speaks the language, but is actually a national of that country, and that is their mother tongue. What's difficult there sometimes is to find somebody who has that knowledge and that knowledge, and also has knowledge and experience of running paid search campaigns. If you can find both, then that's the optimum place to be. But do take the time to really localize language and to demonstrate that you fully understand the customer and create content specifically for them. So that's your landing pages, that's the ads, ad copy, and certainly keywords, which we'll come on to in a second. Part of that process should be some kind of QA, because often you won't have experience of those languages yourself, and you're pretty much trusting other people to create that content for you and represent your brand. And really, it's such an important part of driving sales for your business that you need to make sure that it is as good as it can be, and therefore you need other people to just cast an eye over that as well. And Google isn't always the answer. So whilst in Australia Google dominates in terms of market share, there are other markets where it's not as strong. So the US, whilst it's still pretty strong, obviously there are other search engines there to consider. And I've already mentioned Naver in Korea and Yandex in Russia, and of course Yahoo is the most popular one in Japan. So understanding the local offerings as well is really important, and you should certainly be on those. In lots of cases, the volumes, they might be slightly more economical, excuse me, than Google, and provide a better return. And then keywords. When we're talking about paid search, obviously keywords are fundamentally important to the success of the campaigns, is where you start. So all the search engines will provide some kind of tool that will help you understand the keywords that you should be bidding on and the likely volumes around those. You'll be doing that already with your local campaigns. But as I say, don't just simply translate, because, well, I'll give you an example. Hopefully it's a slightly relevant example, but the Spanish word for bus is la coche, excuse the pronunciation, la coche, I believe. And that's the Spanish word for the bus. But I think there are something like 11 variations across 6 different Spanish-speaking countries. So if you're targeting South America and around there, it's about really having a handle on that, really localizing your keywords in those different areas. Don't assume that the same words are being used across the board. So that's what I talk about, or mean when I'm talking about localizing your keywords. Of course, add negatives as you would with any campaign. That's just best practice. And don't forget to use search query reports to really build out your keyword sets. And that will really help in other markets and other languages to understand exactly that, the language and the turn of phrase that people are using when they're looking for your products. And then something, lastly, sort of the fifth area, one that we firmly believe in, is, paid search is never done. I don't think you ever get to the end of it. There is always more to it that you could be doing. It's just understanding what those things are. So we take a rigorous test and learn methodology to all the accounts that we look after. And we take that right through to the point where we document or create almost a mini business case for clients to say, this is the test that we want to do, this is why we want to do it, and this is what we think why we think it'll work. And then we can attribute to that a timeline and a budget, and importantly, set some expectation about what we think it's going to deliver. And then run that test. And on average, or rather a minimum test period is probably a couple of weeks. And then once you finish that test, you can either say, yep, that worked, brilliant, add it to business as usual, or no, that didn't generate what we expected. You either adjust the test slightly or you just can it, but at least now you know. So always be testing, always be learning, and always be testing again. But a word of warning, and again, something that we've seen more than once, is people finding something that works in one country and then straight away implementing it in another. And that doesn't always work. So as I say, just because it works in one country does not mean it's going to work in another. So be careful. Even if a test is successful, yes, take it to another market, but run the same test. Don't just blow out budgets early expecting to generate great results, because that possibly might fail. So just to wrap up there, when we're planning and executing international paid search, the objectives are fundamental. And I know that sounds silly because you'd expect most people would have thought that through properly. But as I say, it's not always the case, and you do need to spend some time really thinking on that. And then also think about how you're going to build out and structure your accounts. And that's across different search engines, of course, but do spend the time to develop them properly. It will save you so much aggravation further down the track. And then localize. Find the people that can help you to localize your content, both on site, your ad copy, and your keywords. Without doing that, then you're almost destined to fail. So really spend the time and the money there for sure. And of course, it's all about keywords as normal. And then, as I've just explained, that sort of test and learn approach will reap you the best rewards over time. So that's it, actually. I feel like I've sort of rattled through that a little bit. But what I have got, and in fact, I think we're going to be able to share a link to this, is we have an ebook on 9 international export tools. I've touched on a few of them during this presentation, but there are a couple of others in there as well, which hopefully would be useful. And of course, if anyone has any further questions, I think we've got time for questions at the end of this, but my contact details are on screen. If you want to get in touch, feel free to give me a call on that number there, or indeed have a look at our blog. If you search our blog for international, there's a wealth of information there about international e-commerce and paid search.
Thank you, Dan, for a very insightful presentation. Guys, I've just sent out that ebook link. It's on the chat on your dashboard, so you'll find it there if you want to grab that. But yeah, I certainly learned a lot about, how to leverage the cross-border e-commerce opportunity here in Australia, and some great and very insightful and useful tips, Dan. So thank you. Look, we've got a few questions lined up from our audience today. The first one for you, Dan, is what impact would GDPR have on online marketing in Europe?
Okay, yeah, good one. I didn't touch on this at all. The GDPR, I'm sure everybody's familiar, but it's the General Data Protection Regulation, which is going to be enforced across Europe. I think it comes in on the 25th of May this year. And basically what that looks at is, what it covers is the collection of use of people's personal data and information for any citizens of the EU or people living in the EU. So basically what that means is any company or any business, no matter where they are in the world, but if they are engaging with EU citizens online, it really is to do with the data that you're able to collect, and that's sort of personal data. So what's personal data? Well, I think for us it's certainly device ID and people's IP addresses would certainly fall within there. So I think the biggest impact Yeah, the biggest impact this will probably have on online marketing is probably around how we implement tracking technology. So my understanding is that third-party tracking technology, so that's things like AdWords, Facebook, Twitter, even companies like Criteo, that third-party tracking tech shouldn't be activated until the user gives explicit consent by effectively opting in. So how exactly that's going to be managed, I don't know. It shouldn't affect anyone's ability to buy from you, but what that would do if people didn't opt in or give consent is that would certainly impact your ability to retarget them, for example. Google and Facebook haven't said too much about this as yet, but I expect that they will before the 25th of May, and they will communicate and have hopefully some solutions that we can put in place before that point. Just on that, we do have, I mentioned the blog before, if you go to our blog, croud.com/blog, and search for GDPR, there's some information on there about some of the possible implications. It's hard to say really completely because I've not read it myself, the actual document, but how it's going to be applied specifically for digital, I don't know whether that's been fully nutted out yet. We haven't got long to sort it out, but I believe someone was saying to me the other day that the whole document doesn't even mention, for example, cookies aren't mentioned once. So it'll be interesting. I hope that answers the question.
All right. Well, we've got another question here. And guys, please feel free to ask any questions on your dialog box dashboard there, because we have time for a couple more questions. So the second question is, what are the main differences between Google AdWords and Baidu?
Okay. Yeah, AdWords and Baidu. Look, they are, well, probably on the face of it, they're pretty similar now. Baidu has come a long way. Obviously, Google AdWords has been in market a lot longer, and anyone who's been involved in paid search, for the last 10, 13 years, 15 years or so, will have seen huge progress in terms of the ability or capabilities of that platform. Baidu is running along at a pretty decent clip as well. There are a few differences. I think probably the biggest one is not so much in terms of how you manage and optimize campaigns, but whilst Google will either debit your credit card or bill your credit card, or if you're spending enough money with Google, they'll possibly let you go to invoicing, monthly invoices. Baidu, you have to pay your media up front. So that's an important consideration if you're thinking of running campaigns on Baidu. You have to, and if you're sending that money from Australia, for example, it can take, we've seen it sort of between 7 or 10 days for that money to turn up. So it's worth thinking about that time factor in there for sure. Some of the smaller differences when it comes to actually sort of optimizing campaigns, I think one would be around delivery method. In AdWords, I think you've had two types, so it's either standard or accelerated. Baidu only has accelerated, which means that you could find your daily budgets, for example, you might reach those caps earlier than you expect, and your ads will have stopped showing. That's because it works on this accelerated basis. And whilst the two, lastly I'd say on that, whilst the two engines are, as I say, fairly similar, what you won't be able to do is simply take your Google AdWords campaign and effectively replicate that into Baidu, like you can to a certain extent with Bing, for example. So you'll need a different setup process. So expect to spend more time there.
All right. And final question is, what other channels, Dan, would you recommend for retail outside of paid search?
Yeah, great. I would think, well, definitely social. And I think obviously, Facebook for sure. WeChat in China, really important. Huge platforms, both of them with really quite sophisticated advertising propositions. Depending on the market you're going after, don't forget Twitter. It is much more popular in countries like the US and the UK, certainly more so than it is in Australia. And the fact that Twitter made a profit last quarter would suggest that there are more brands spending more money with them, and so that advertising must be working. I think one of the most exciting areas actually in social a colleague was chatting to me about this just yesterday, is Instagram. And last year they had quite an exciting new development rollout. I think it's only in the US at the moment and only for a certain number of retailers, but basically it's Instagram shopping. So if you're selling, I think it's apparel, jewelry, or beauty products, it gives you the ability to tag up an image or parts of an image and provides specific product detail. So if, imagine there's a picture of a model and she's wearing a certain pair of shoes or holding a certain handbag or whatever that might be, you can tag each of those items, and then the user can click on that to be taken through to somewhere that provides more information about that product, and then from there can actually click to buy from the retailer's website. So that's a big change in user experience, because currently brands, you have to tell people to click on the link in my bio if you want to go to the website. So I think that's exciting. Look, beyond social, marketplaces is a huge and should certainly be part of the mix. Obviously, places like China, you've got Tmall Global, which is massive. There's one in India called Snapdeal, which I think has something like over 40 million users now. Absolutely huge. So yeah, certainly marketplaces, and again, just understanding which different marketplaces operate in different countries. And then finally, probably affiliate. And I think affiliates would provide you with perhaps a lower cost and certainly maybe a lower risk entry into new markets, and certainly help you to provide the ability to test at a fairly low level, I would imagine. So yeah, those are the three really: social, marketplaces, and affiliates.
All right. Well, thank you for answering those questions, Dan. And yes, just to everyone out there, the link for this webinar video will be available after this. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, for taking the time, obviously, during your lunch break. So it was definitely a very valuable session. Please sign up to our newsletter, guys, if you haven't already, at www.powerretail.com.au for any more upcoming webinars that could be of help to you. Dan, I don't know if you have time. Just got one more question that's come through, or perhaps you may want to answer this later.
Yep, sure.
It says, out of all Southeast Asia countries, which one would you recommend to enter first?
Oh, that's a really good question. Off the top of my head, I would probably suggest Singapore, and the reasons for that would be language. English is widely spoken in Singapore, but also ease of doing business there. I think Singapore is well set up to encourage overseas businesses to do businesses in Singapore, more so than perhaps some of the others. Obviously, it's a smaller country, small population, but for those reasons, I think it would probably be a good one. China's where it's at in terms of volume and opportunity for sales, but I think as an initial step, maybe Singapore. Yeah.
Very good. All right. Well, second sign off. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Dan, again, for such an insightful webinar. I'll be signing off now. I hope you all have a lovely day today. See you, Dan.
Thanks, Pranitha. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Bye, guys.